I'm delighted this evening to have the privilege of introducing this evening's speaker, Al Roth. Al is the inaugural Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford. Al arrived here just in time to win the Nobel Prize, which we're very pleased about, not just because he won the prize, but because he did it here. This was more like a homecoming for Al, since he received master's and doctor's degrees in operations research at Stanford in 1973 and 74. Before Stanford, he was the George Gunn Professor of Economics and Business Administration at Harvard, and before that, he was the Andrew Mellon Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh. We're so excited to have Al with us. He is an expert in market design, and not just in the theory of market design, but in putting that into practice and in things, as he'll tell you, like school systems and kidney transplants and so on. It's a privilege and an honor, Al, to have you with us. And please join me in giving a very warm GSB welcome to Al Roth.
Thanks. See you next week. So it's good to be here. I guess I heard from the reactions to the deans calling out the years. I have some idea of how many of you are here from 2012 and from 1998, and welcome back. I also returned this year. As the dean mentioned, I got my PhD in '74. My advisor was Bob Wilson. How many of you had a class with Bob when you were here? Well, I hope you appreciated him. He started market design. He's one of the giants in that field, and I'm going to tell you about what's happened to it since then, because it's grown quite a bit since its beginnings here at Stanford. So, what market designers do is think about it might better be called marketplace design. We think about what markets do and what marketplaces have to accomplish in order to make markets work well. And so what I want to do today, in just talking to you, is to think a little bit about what markets are, because you're all out in the market now, but markets are lots of different things. And I want to spend the time together tonight talking about how markets work and how they fail and how we can fix them when they're broken, and how markets may be a more comprehensive class of institutions than you're accustomed to thinking about. And so I'll tell you a little about my work, and I'll focus on the parts that are least like the markets you're familiar with. And so let me start by asking, what's the role of money in markets? So here's a fruit market in the New York Stock Exchange. And mostly when we think about markets, we think about commodity markets. And in commodity markets, the role of money is huge. Supply and demand decide who gets what. So the thing about commodity markets is if you're making small enough trades in a big enough market, you don't particularly care. You don't have to care who you're dealing with. Right? When you buy 100 shares of AT&T on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't have to fill out any application form. You don't care who the seller is. You're not worried about whether he's taken good care of those shares while he had them, and he's not going to worry about whether you'll take good care of them when you're having them. This is an arm's length, anonymous transaction. And the job of the New York Stock Exchange is price discovery. It's to find the price at which supply will equal demand, and that's the price at which you'll transact. But in many markets, prices don't do all the work. And you're all familiar with these markets, although we don't always think of them that way. For instance, Stanford doesn't fill its MBA class by raising tuition until just enough people are ready to come to Stanford, right? Stanford is expensive to go to, but it's cheap enough that lots of people would like to come. And so Stanford sets a tuition, gets lots of applicants, and then chooses which ones can come. So the price doesn't decide who gets into Stanford, okay? The labor markets are like that too. When you go out on the job market, it may sometimes seem as if your company lowers the wage until just enough people remain who want to do the work. But that's probably not the way they do that in most of the companies that you work for. So instead, they get lots of applications, and they have to choose who to make an offer to. And of course, just as Stanford can't choose who comes, firms can't choose who comes either. You can't choose to go there, but they can't choose that you come there. They have to compete with the other offers you're getting. Stanford has to compete with Harvard. So matching markets are the markets in which you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You also have to be chosen, right? You can't just decide to come to Stanford. You have to be admitted. You can't just decide to show up for work at Google. You have to be hired. But Stanford can't just decide that you'll come either, and Google can't just decide that you'll come. So these are matching markets that have courtship. They're a lot like marriage, right? You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And a lot of the marketplace institutions are about that courtship. They're applications and admissions and selections and visiting days and recruitment. So I've been involved with my colleagues in a bunch of matching markets. And some of them use money, and some of them don't use money at all. And I'll focus today on some of the stranger ones, on one of the stranger ones that doesn't. But even the ones that use money, the labor markets, for instance, that isn't what decides who gets what. So the thing about matching markets is just about every market that isn't a commodity market is a matching market. You care about who you're transacting with. And the price, therefore, isn't the only thing that decides what happens in the market. So my colleagues and I have designed a lot of labor market clearinghouses. For instance, if you have friends who are doctors, they go through an unusual job market when they graduate from medical school called the National Resident Matching Program, and that's something that I got to design. We've made some innovations for new PhD economists recently. That's one that's close to home. Those are both markets where, of course, money is used. Everyone who's a doctor or who's a professor of economics gets paid, but it's not the pay that decides who's a professor at Stanford or who's a doctor at Stanford hospitals. Now, there are other matching markets where we don't use money at all because we don't think it would be an appropriate thing to do. So school choice systems for who goes to which public schools, right? We think, as a society, we think we have an obligation to provide education to our children, and public school is mandatory and public school is free, but there still are issues of choice, who goes to which school. And my colleagues and I have gotten to design choice systems for New York City high schools and for Boston public schools, and recently in Denver and New Orleans. And just last week, we hosted a conference of many school districts here to talk about these things. And so I imagine that some of the technology, some of the kinds of things I'll tell you a little about when I talk about kidney exchange, are going to diffuse into more American cities, maybe one near you. But what I'm going to tell you about today mostly is kidney exchange. Kidney exchange is a market where no money is used. But after I tell you about it, I hope you'll see why I think of it as being clearly a marketplace. And so that's really the subtext of my talk today, is how things that you might not think of as markets act like marketplaces, and we should think of them as markets. And again, many, many of the most important markets are matching markets. So before I go on to tell you about kidneys, think about all the matching that you have all gone through, right? At some point you got into schools at various levels. You got into college, right? These are things that cost a lot of money sometimes, but the money doesn't determine who goes where. Then you're all graduates of Stanford. You've all gotten jobs. Some of you have created your own jobs, but some of you have gotten jobs with existing firms. Many of you have. Those are matching markets. Many of you are married. Some of you who aren't married are going to be married sometime in the future. You're engaged in a kind of marriage market where you can't just choose what you want. You have to also be chosen. And I'm going to talk to you about some aspects of medical care where you can't just choose what you want, but also have to be chosen. In particular, I'm going to talk about organ transplantation. So this is a good example of the allocation of scarce resources. So it's a natural topic for economists, but it's without the use of money because in most of the West, we have laws against buying organs for transplantation. And it's a big part of the economy. Although you can't buy a kidney, the care of patients with end-stage renal disease, with kidney disease, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So this is an industry with lots of interests. It's a not insignificant part of healthcare expenditures. It's the biggest single program in Medicare. So many billions of dollars are spent on this. And The unusual thing about transplantation is that it's not only the treatment of choice, it's not only the best treatment, it's also the cheapest. So dialysis is very expensive. It costs Medicare about $85,000 a year to keep someone on dialysis, but it only costs about $120,000 for someone to get a transplant, after which they need immunosuppressive drugs that cost about $20,000 a year. And they get up and go back to work, something that when they're on dialysis after a while they can't do. So this is not an insignificant part of the economy, but it's a part of the economy that has very scarce resources, and I'll tell you how we try to get more transplants, and in a marketplace that plays out without any money, although there's important money in the background. So what's the story with kidney exchange? So many more people need kidneys than there are organs available. So there are 95,000 people on the deceased donor waiting list at the moment in the United States. They're waiting for an organ from a deceased donor. So when you signed up for a California driver's license, when you were here, if you did that, you had an opportunity to register on the California Organ Donor Registry. That's where deceased donors mostly come from, that registry. So the waiting list has 100,000 people. That means you might have to wait a long time because we only have about 11,000 deceased donors in the United States a year, 11,000 deceased donor transplants. That's only about 6,000 deceased donors. But deceased donors aren't the only source of transplants. You each have 2 kidneys. And if you're as healthy as I hope you are, then if you knew someone who had kidney disease, you could give them a kidney. Because if you're healthy, you could remain healthy with 1 kidney. So you might be healthy enough to give someone you love a kidney, but they might still not be able to take your kidney. And that's where the possibility of exchange comes in, which of course is a natural subject for economists to study. So the idea of exchange is you want to give a kidney to someone, in this case, supposing you're donor 1, but your potential recipient has a different blood type than you do. So blood type A and blood type B. So you'd like to give recipient 1 a kidney, but you can't. She's got a different blood type than you do. And donor 2 and recipient 2 are in the opposite situation. So an exchange is possible where donor 1, the blood type A donor, gives a kidney to recipient 2, the blood type A recipient. Everyone gets a compatible kidney. This kind of thing happens for other reasons than blood type incompatibility. Turns out the chance that one of you could take my kidney is a little over 50%. The chance that my wife can take my kidney is only about 30%. And that's because my wife and I are parents. And in the course of childbirth, my wife's immune system might have been exposed to some of the proteins that our boys inherit from me. And if so, she might have antibodies to those proteins that would be ready to attack my kidney if it should show up. So there are other kinds of incompatibilities than just blood type incompatibility. And someone who's been sick for a long time or who's had a previous kidney transplant will have lots of antibodies to human proteins, and they'll be hard to match, whereas other people will be easy to match. I just came back from Korea, which is a place actually where kidney exchange has been going for some time. And the issue there is in Korea, but not in the United States, blood types A and B are equally frequent. So this kind of simple exchange can go on quite easily there. Okay, now notice that no money changed hands in that exchange. And there are many reasons for that, but one reason is it's against the law. Okay, so here's a sentence from the 1984 National Organ Transplant Act that says it shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly acquire, etc., any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So you might worry that that's going to rule out kidney exchange too. That sure looks like valuable considerations going on there, a kidney's being exchanged for a kidney. And you could get very philosophical about this, but eventually we got an amendment to the nota that simply says the preceding sentence, that one, doesn't apply to kidney exchange. I learned something about federal legislation while this was going on. There was no opposition to this. No one opposes kidney exchange. But it still took 3 Congresses before this bill passed. And it didn't pass until Charlie Norwood, the representative from Georgia, whose name is on the bill now, died of a immunosuppressive-related disease. He'd had a transplant, and you take immunosuppressive drugs forever after, so you're vulnerable to some kind of diseases. So it went down just out of neglect in 2 Congresses. In the 3rd Congress, Charlie Norwood died, and his colleagues named the bill after him and passed it. It passed by acclaim with no dissent. So, legislation there are some frictions out there in the world. Okay, so let me tell you about some other frictions, about the actual frictions in running an exchange. So here's a picture of an exchange. I'm the man in the yellow gown. You can tell that I'm keeping my hands out of the way so no one hands me anything. And what I would like to not be handed is in this bucket here. There's a kidney in there. And behind me, not in this picture, but behind me in this picture, off screen, is another operating room. And the kidney has just been removed, just steps away and carried over into this operating room where it's being transplanted into this patient. And this is all happening in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at the same time, in Toledo, Ohio, the donor, her patient, and the transplant recipient, his donor, are doing the same thing in Toledo, Ohio. And when I say at the same time, I mean literally at the same time, because you can't write a contract on a kidney because no valuable consideration can be given for a kidney. So what they do in this kind of exchange is they prep the patients, they anesthetize them, they make the initial incisions. Then they get on their cell phones and they say, we're ready to go here in Cincinnati. Are you ready in Toledo? And when they're told that everything went smoothly in the preparations in Toledo, then they go ahead and they take the kidney and everything proceeds from there. So this kind of simultaneous exchange requires 4 surgeries at the same time: 2 nephrectomies, taking the kidney out, and 2 transplants, putting the kidney in. That means it takes a lot of resources to do this simple exchange. You need 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams to do it. So even the simplest 2-way exchange is hard. It involves a lot of resources. And we'd like to do other kinds of exchanges, because if you're restricted to 2-way exchanges, you don't get as many transplants as you could otherwise. This way we get 2 transplants that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So that's great. 2 live donor organs are donated to patients who need them. But sometimes you can't find 2-way exchanges, so sometimes you'd like to be able to do a 3-way exchange, for instance. Here's 3 pairs. Each pair can give a kidney to the patient in the next pair in a 3-way cycle. So that would require 6 operating rooms and 6 surgical teams. And over time, we've become able to do that. We can assemble those logistics, but that's about our limit. Right? Every now and then, a larger exchange gets done, but the logistics of getting everybody in place simultaneously to do a 3-way exchange is about all we can manage. And it's still not enough. So the question is, what can you do in this marketplace that we're creating to facilitate exchange, where exchanges are hard? Large exchanges are hard because of the simultaneity requirement. Well, it turns out, so here's a picture where think of each circle as being typically a patient-donor pair, and an arrow goes from one circle to another if a kidney from that pair can go to the patient in the other pair. Okay, so you see that there's a 3-way exchange that's possible here and a 2-way exchange. There's also a non-directed donor. So this is a donor who doesn't have a particular patient in mind, and we can sometimes get some chains going where he'll give a kidney to some pair, and the donor in that pair will give a kidney to the patient in the next pair, and so forth. So let's think about those chains a little bit. When non-directed donors first started to show up, so 10 years ago they were pretty rare, what we used to say to them, first of all, they would be, any donor gets a thorough physical exam and psychological exam, make sure they know what they're doing and they're willing. And non-directed donors 10 years ago were treated with a certain suspicion, sort of the catch-22 of surgery was, if you want to give someone a kidney, maybe you're unbalanced. But nowadays we've seen many more of these. Just incidentally, a big group of non-directed donors, when you look at the non-directed donors in the United States, a big group of them come from faith-based organizations. The second big group are policemen and firemen. They turn out to like to save people, and they're not afraid. But what we used to say to them is, we used to say, well, you pass through all the screens. You could give a kidney to a patient on the waiting list. Somebody waiting for a long time for a kidney, a live donor kidney is better than a deceased donor kidney. You'll save their life. And that way you'd get an extra transplant that you wouldn't otherwise. But now that we have this pool of patient-donor pairs, we can say to non-directed donors, we can say, you could start a chain. You could give a kidney to a patient who has a donor, who would give a kidney to another patient who has a donor, and that donor could give to a patient on the waiting list. So this is a sort of abstract look at that. This is what it looks like, when you take a picture of the people. And one question is, why are there only 6 people in that picture? And the reason there are only 6 people in the picture is we can only muster 6 operating rooms at a time. Okay, so as long as we're doing these chains simultaneously, this is as big as the picture gets. So let's think again about this marketplace. Why do we do them simultaneously, and could we relax that in some circumstances? Because if you could do it not simultaneously, you could use the same surgical teams and the same operating rooms over at different times, and you could get more people into the chain. So let's think about why we do it simultaneously. So let's go back to that simple exchange that I showed you about initially between 2 pairs. And suppose we always do these simultaneously. Let's see why. Supposing we didn't do it simultaneously. Suppose the idea was that on day 1, donor 2 would give a kidney to recipient 1, so he doesn't have a kidney anymore. He's successfully given that kidney. And on day 2, donor 1 is supposed to give a kidney to recipient 2, but something goes wrong, and that link breaks, and it doesn't happen. Well, that's a tragedy for pair 2. They've had a surgery that didn't help them. They've given a kidney and not gotten one, and they don't have a kidney anymore. They can't participate in kidney exchange next week because they don't have a kidney to exchange. So they've been tragically harmed, so we never do that. We always do that simultaneously. But now suppose a living non-directed donor shows up. And let's think about doing that non-simultaneously. So on day 1, the non-directed donor gives to recipient 1 successfully. And on day 2, the donor 1 fails to give to recipient 2 for whatever reason. Just same reason it was here, whatever it was. Well, that's really disappointing. Recipient 2 didn't get a kidney. But it's not tragic. The pair 2, they haven't given a kidney yet. They still have a kidney. They can take part in kidney exchange next week. And they're no worse off than they were before the non-directed donor showed up. So they're disappointed, but they're not really harmed. The cost of a broken link is much less. So we can start to explore whether the benefit of doing things non-simultaneously might be worth the risk. We'd have to discover how big the risk is and how big the benefit is. So the first non-simultaneous exchange we did was in 2007. It was reported in this paper in 2009. And the first author is Mike Reese. He's one of the heroes of this story. He's the kidney surgeon in Toledo, Ohio. There's a bunch of economists and computer scientists in here, so it's an unusual medical paper. And that first non-simultaneous chain had 10 transplants. It had 20 people in the picture. Okay? Here's the better picture, as it showed up in People magazine sometime later. Okay? So that's a much bigger picture. So what's going on there? Here's a marketplace that we've now opened up a new kind of exchange, and we're starting to see more transplants. Well, what's going on? It turns out that when we started kidney exchange and no one knew anything about it, the patients we got were ordinary sick people, ordinary people with kidney disease. And some of them were pretty easy to match to each other, and some of them were hard to match. As in the last 10 years, as kidney exchange has grown in the United States, transplant centers have learned to do it, and they're now often withholding their easy-to-match pairs. So if people come in and they're like those 2 pairs I showed you, often we never see them in kidney exchange. They just get transplanted in their hospital. It means that the patients we are seeing are hard to match. What does it mean to be hard to match? It means you've got a lot of antibodies, so there aren't many kidneys you can take. When we draw those arrows between circles, there aren't so many arrows. Okay? So here's a bit of data from one of our kidney exchanges. And you can see there are these guys in blue who have a lot of arrows pointing into them. They can take a lot of kidneys. They're the low sensitized patients. But there's lots of people who, although their donors can give kidneys to the easy to match patients, they can't get kidneys for many people. So this graph's a little hard to look at. So what I want you to think about is supposing all those things are sort of strings and you grab the blue nodes in your hand and you shake it, you're going to get a picture that looks like this jellyfish. And at the top, we've got the easy to match pairs, and they're sort of in a densely connected part of the graph. Lots of exchanges can go on there. And then there are these chains hanging down. And it's those chains that we're getting in these long simultaneous chains. If you get a non-directed donor, you can start at the bottom of one of those chains and just move it right up. And some of those chains can be pretty long. So here's a chain that has 60 people in it. Okay? The very first one is a non-directed donor. And the others are all hard to match patients who we couldn't take care of in small exchanges. So 60 people in the picture means 30 transplants, 30 donors and 30 transplants. Okay, so that's basically what we're seeing now. This is the fastest growing part of organ transplantation. And it's exciting to see. But let's think a little about this. Why don't we just buy and sell kidneys, right? When you talk to Gary Becker at the University of Chicago, he says, there's no shortage of kidneys. You've all got two. This room has a huge excess of kidneys because you only need one. Okay, so I don't know the answer to why we don't allow buy and sell kidneys, but it's certainly something that economists and business people ought to know more about, because there are lots of things we don't allow you to buy and sell, and that reflects the fact that people have, ordinary people, not economists, not business people, have intuitions about what's the proper scope of markets. We probably have some of those intuitions ourselves. And one reason to think about it is because making markets illegal doesn't necessarily stop them from happening, right? So there are lots of things you can't buy and sell in the United States, and there are black markets for many of them. Think of illegal drugs, for example. So let's think about this a little bit. And when I started to think about this, I needed a word that would say what I wanted, so I borrowed the word repugnance. And I don't mean, when I say a transaction is repugnant, I'm not thinking of its simple meaning that you don't like it. What I mean is, I'll say a transaction is repugnant if some people would like to engage in it and other people don't want them to. Okay? So repugnance has been really important. Historically, it's important presently. Here we are in California. I think a prototypical repugnant transaction, the way I'm using the term, is same-sex marriage. Right? A repugnant transaction is a transaction that some people want to engage in and other people don't want them to. So right now, if Rhode Island changes its law, which I think they're about to, we'll have 10 states and the District of Columbia that allow same-sex marriage, and the rest of the states don't. And right now, California is one of the ones that don't, although before the Supreme Court, they've already heard oral arguments, is a case that will decide whether same-sex marriage is legal in California. So whether it's legal or not, there are going to be Californians who want to marry each other. The question is, will we allow them to pursue that transaction? So that's a repugnant transaction, and the fact that it's changing and is likely to keep changing means that these repugnancies change over time. So think, for instance, about interest on loans. There were hundreds of years in Europe where charging interest on loans was a repugnant transaction. There were people who wanted loans and people who would like to charge interest on them, but it wasn't allowed. And that's changed, and it's had, of course, profound effects on the economy. We could hardly have the global capitalist economy that we have if we didn't have a market for capital. So the idea that you couldn't have a market for capital had first-order important effects on how we organize our economic lives. But it's not the case that as we get more modern, things that used to be repugnant become less repugnant. It also goes the other way. We live in a country where there used to be markets for slaves in the United States. And that's not a great example because it's not a voluntary transaction on the part of the slave. But the most common way to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean during the years after the American Revolution was indentured servitude. There you would be in Ireland or someplace, and you would want to come to Boston, and you didn't have the fare to pay the captain to take you across. And so you would sign articles of indenture, and when he got to Boston, he would sell your labor services unconditional, you couldn't quit, for 5 years to the highest bidder. And that's a form of involuntary servitude that is entered into voluntarily, but the 13th Amendment to the Constitution says we don't allow that anymore. So there are things that used to be repugnant and are not anymore, and there are things that used to not be repugnant and now are. So these are things worth understanding. I don't pretend to understand them, but let's think about them a little, because I think they're worth thinking about and fun to think about. Why can't you eat horse or dog meat in a restaurant in California? You may not want to eat horse or dog meat in a restaurant in California, so you might not know that you can't, but you can't. In fact, well, I'll tell you about the rest of the country, but the short answer is it's against the law, right? Horse meat may not be offered for sale for human consumption. It's a felony. Dog meat is just a misdemeanor. There's no law in California against eating grasshoppers or cockroaches, right? By and large, you can't eat them in restaurants either, and that's because no one wants to. The reason there's a law against eating horse meat is not because no one wants to. It's because some people want to and other people don't want them to. So this was actually passed by the class of 1998 when they were here in a referendum. Okay, so you guys got to vote on this if you were California residents. As many people voted for it, it was a referendum, as many people voted for it as voted for Gray Davis, who was elected governor that year. So, so again, this is something, because we have a referendum system in California, there were people who thought it was a really bad idea that other people were eating horse meat and that we ought to make a law against it. And, through the magic of referenda, they did. Now, needless to say, this is something that varies by time and place. There are lots of places in Europe where you can eat horse meat. You can't eat horse meat anywhere in the United States. It's not illegal except in California. But in order to eat meat in a restaurant in the United States, it has to be inspected. And Congress has refused to allow to provide funds for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to inspect horse meat. So although it's not illegal, it's a crime in California. It's not a crime in New York, but no horse meat is available in New York. You'll have to go to France or Japan. There are lots of places where they like horse meat. Okay, so as I've been saying, transactions vary from place to place, whether they're repugnant or not. So let's think about dwarf tossing. You guys are going to go out drinking tonight. Maybe you've thought about dwarf tossing already. So here's in England, it's legal. And Lenny the Giant, he's this small man wearing the helmet. And he earns his living by engaging in an athletic event in which larger and probably drunker men throw him for distance. And he lands athletically and rolls and is wearing safety equipment. Here's the Ontario Dwarf Tossing Ban Act of 2003. It says in Ontario, this is a repugnant transaction. You can't do it. And it's not an occupational health and safety. It doesn't say Lenny the Giant should wear a helmet. Lenny the Giant is already wearing a helmet. It says no person shall organize a dwarf tossing event or engage in dwarf tossing. It basically says, yuck. You shouldn't do that. Now, a French dwarf, when France banned dwarf tossing, a French dwarf who wanted to continue earning his living this way. So it's a repugnant transaction. There are people who want to engage in it and other people who don't want them to. And that happened in France too. And the French dwarf took his case before the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And he said that his right to employment was being denied. And the French case said, this is just, it's a sort of yuck, but in French. It said, this is an affront to human dignity. We are all less human when Manuel Wachenheim earns his living this way. And he had a very moving statement. When I read the case materials, I thought, the little guy is going to win. Because what he said is, his statement said something like, he said, the essence of human dignity is having a job. And there aren't a lot of jobs for dwarves in France. And this is my job. And I remember thinking, ooh, but he didn't win. France won. The UN committee found for France, basically saying that every time he earned his living that way, each of us became a little less human, and that we shouldn't allow it, even though it was a voluntary transaction. So repugnant transactions are of all sorts. But it's hard to tell what they are, right? It's hard to tell why horse meat is repugnant in California and not in France. Because again, it's not the Wild West. That was a 1998 referendum. And it's not just the small size of the dwarves. Jockeys are small. We don't mind small guys riding horses and seeing how fast they can make them go. And there are things that are even closer to dwarf tossing, like wife carrying. So these guys are also athletes. They are not married to each other. Wife carrying is for speed, not for distance. But it's not dignified. Here are the American champions. They still use the old-fashioned technique. But nowadays, most people use the Estonian position, and particularly for getting through the water hazards. So there's a North American championship at Sunday River Ski Resort each year near Boston, and there's a world championship in Finland each year. So I'm not aware of any place in which wife carrying is repugnant. But I have trouble thinking of why. I'm not sure it shouldn't be, but I have trouble thinking of a rule that would say dwarf tossing is and wife carrying isn't, or vice versa. So although I can't think of general rules, one thing you notice is that adding money to the mix sometimes makes things repugnant. Okay, so something isn't repugnant by itself, but when you add money to it, it becomes repugnant. So interest on loans. Loans weren't repugnant. People didn't, in medieval Europe, didn't think that it was a bad thing to lend someone else money to start a business, to buy stock for a ship, to go on a trading mission. It was charging interest, having your money earn money, that was repugnant. Adoption. Adoption is expensive. If you want to adopt a baby, it'll probably cost a lot of money. But you may not buy the baby from the birth mother. Okay, there are some parts of the transaction that you can't do. Prostitution is illegal in many places, not in all places. If you look around the world, and different parts are illegal. Sometimes brokerage is illegal, pimping is illegal, but prostitution is not. But by and large, we're not, in most of the world, we're not against sex. We're against payment for sex, right? So it's adding money that makes those transactions repugnant. And sometimes there are transactions that have money that aren't repugnant, but if there's too much money, it becomes repugnant. And that's where we think about laws against price gouging. If there's a blizzard and you want to raise the price on your snow shovels at your hardware store, you'll often find yourself in violation of local law, of state law. And similarly, in Europe right now, there's talk about limiting the pay of bankers, and I mean, we have some of that in the United States as well, with the idea being that money is fine, but too much money might make a transaction that we didn't approve of. So, some of this may impact you guys. These are people, us, especially those of us who haven't gone to business school and aren't economists, ordinary people, have intuitions about economic transactions that often shape what markets we see and what we don't. And markets require lots of social support. So we would be well advised to understand these intuitions better than we do. Most people can pick The Economist out from this New Yorker cartoon. Right? So this poor guy, he's come to dinner and he's trying to, he didn't have time to get a bottle of wine. He's trying to offer his host some money, and that's, you laugh. If you invited me to dinner at your house, the surest thing I could do that would get me never invited again is after dinner say, that was a wonderful dinner. That would cost, $75 at a nice restaurant. Can I just pay you for that? You'd say, this guy doesn't understand. We're not a restaurant. We're not selling food. Inviting him to dinner at our house is an offer of friendship. And he could invite us to dinner at his house. He could invite us back. He could bring a nice bottle of wine. He could do a lot of things that would look like a transaction, but he can't pay for it. Right? So even those of us who are very into the economy understand that there are some things that it would be really offensive to offer to pay. There are some transactions that can't be monetized. And when you think about why we have laws against selling kidneys, buying and selling kidneys, there are a couple of arguments. One of them, I've sort of classified them here. One of them is just that it's a bad idea. It's a bad thing. People should never be means and always should be ends. Many of the Christian churches adopt that kind of language. Another, hardest for economists to understand, is they say, if you offer too much money, it's so tempting that you do it against your better judgment. It's a form of coercion. I have trouble understanding that because, of course, if you offered me $10 million for my house, you could have it. I would just feel like I had to sell it to you. I would be coerced, but happy. The arguments that I can make the most sense out of and have the most sympathy with are the slippery slope arguments. We don't have much time today, so I'm not going to go into them. But those are arguments that say, if you start with allowing people to sell their kidneys, you might end up living in a less sympathetic society than you would like to live in. And I think those have to be taken very seriously, and we have to think about them. So let me get a sense of the meeting. Test yourself for repugnance. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Are you willing to contemplate carefully regulated sales of live kidneys? Put up your hand if you are. Okay, keep it up, because look around, see lots of you, right? MBA reunion. Keep it up, keep it up. How many of you who are willing to contemplate the sales of live kidneys would be willing to contemplate the sales of live hearts? Kills the seller. Voluntary. Okay, so my point is, lots of us have our hands up for kidneys, which means maybe that we feel less of this repugnance than the general public. But many of you, not all of you, until I bullied you, started to pull your hands down for hearts, which means we all have places that we're at least willing to understand the idea that some transactions might be repugnant, even if they were willingly entered into. And therefore, it behooves us to try to understand where other people draw those lines, even when they draw them in different places than we do. right? So you may think kidney sales would be a good idea, but in order to have this kind of discussion, we're going to have to seriously engage with people who think that kidney sales would be a terrible idea, a bad idea, the kind of bad idea that only bad people have. Okay, and I meet lots of those people. So kidney exchange achieves some of the benefits of a market without running into this barrier of repugnance. So the thing we've achieved with kidney exchange, so as market designers, we're very pragmatic. We say you can't sell kidneys. We can debate that till the cows come home, but in the meantime, what are we going to do for the patients? And what we're able to do is get the benefits of exchange without running into the barriers of repugnance. So let me just close with a thought on what is a free market, because here I am, designing markets, and that can seem like a funny thing. And I think the right metaphor to look at is a free market isn't a market without rules. It's a market with rules that allow it to operate freely. The New York Stock Exchange has lots of rules, and some of them are laws that if you violate, you can go to jail, rules against insider trading. And they're designed to help make it a very efficient commodity market. So I think a good metaphor is you think of a wheel that can rotate freely. It rotates freely because it has an axle and well-oiled bearings, and that's what lets it go. So I think the political discussion on free market is often that free markets are laissez-faire. They don't have rules at all. But very few markets are like that. When you get jobs, when you apply for colleges, when you buy and sell stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, you're engaging in markets that have a lot of rules. And if the markets are designed well, then the rules allow the market to work well. So a big part of that, of course, is handing out information, moving it around, and helping aggregate it. So I was advised that I should end by telling you some stories and giving you some advice having to do with the Nobel Prize. So here's a picture of me and the King of Sweden. I'm the guy on the left. Let me tell you a story. You hear about the Nobel Prize in a phone call in the middle of the night if you live in California. But the guys giving the phone call have some experience at this. And it turns out the thing that they're really concerned with is that you shouldn't think it's a hoax. So they call you up in the middle of the night. We actually missed the first phone call. My wife said, I think the phone's ringing. And I woke up and it wasn't ringing. But they called back. And the guy on the phone says, I still don't know who it was who made the initial call, Swedish accent. And he said, you've won the Nobel Prize. He said, but I'm here with 6 of my colleagues, and 2 of them are people you know, and they're now going to tell you. So that was their way of I guess, forestalling that you should say, oh, come on, who is this? Is that Ted? And they did that actually at 3:30. And they said, so it's not going to be announced for a half an hour yet. Keep it a secret. And what I did in that half hour, and this is my advice, what I did in that half hour is I took a shower and I got dressed. And if you're ever in that situation, you should definitely do that because there isn't any time afterward for the next many hours. It was a busy day. Fun, but not relaxing. So it's great for me to be back at Stanford. I welcome you back to Stanford. And there was one slide I skipped. Let me just tell you about that. What do markets do? What do marketplaces do for markets? They have to make the market thick. They have to bring enough people together to make the transactions that will make the market work. Once you have those people together, sometimes it's hard to do the transactions. With kidneys, it's because of the operating rooms, but you have a lot of transactions to consider, so markets have to become uncongested to work well, and they have to be safe to participate in. And some kinds of transactions are repugnant. So I think when you go back out into the marketplace, if you think about these things, you'll get a chance to see markets and market institutions in a little bit of a different way. And that's a good thing. So thank you very much. I've used up our time, but I am willing to take questions if there are questions. Are there microphones around? Does someone? Here you go. There's people with microphones too.
It's live, yeah. Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm just curious. You said there's no contracts because then it would be value consideration, et cetera. But you have a chain of 60 people. So somewhere along the line, you get a guy who goes, we're good. You know.
Absolutely.
So how is that enforced?
So the non-simultaneous donors, the ones who, so we do them in batches, but then there's bridge donors. And the nurse, social workers, transplant coordinators, they talk to these people beforehand, and they don't nominate everyone to be a bridge donor. Our renege rate, our broken link rate is 2%. So mostly it turns out, so one of the things economists are learning is this thing called behavioral economics. One of the things economists are learning is people are a lot nicer than we give them credit for. But this is a more complicated transaction than that. Supposing, it's costly, it's a big deal, but let's think about it. Supposing you're going to be the bridge donor. Why are you the bridge donor? Well, you had signed up to give your sister or your wife or your mother a kidney, and you weren't able to, but because of your willingness, your sister gets a kidney. And now you've agreed that next Tuesday at 5:30 in the morning you'll show up at the OR and give a kidney. Future Thanksgivings at your family are going to remember how you saved your sister's life. The discussion would be a lot funnier if you didn't give the kidney in the end. So, you know, those Thanksgivings would be a different story. So I think, I'm not quite sure what goes into it, but once the transplant coordinators say that we've talked to this person and he's good to go, they almost always are.
Could you talk a little bit about the key elements as you see them for market design for school choice?
Yeah, well, so thickness has to do with getting all the schools involved. There are, some schools sometimes have some volition. If it's a simple district, school district, they can command all the schools and then thickness isn't a problem. But if there are a lot of charter schools and things like that, they sometimes have to be coordinated so that you can get all the schools together so that you can deal with congestion. Because what's congestion in a school choice system? It's many children having multiple offers while many more don't have any offers because multiple offers are being held and wait lists are being formed. So when we looked at this in New York City initially for New York City high schools, we found that 17,000 children a year were getting multiple offers, and about 30,000 at the end of the process had to be put into schools for which they had expressed no preferences just because time ran out on the waiting list. So we looked at the 17,000 who were getting multiple offers, and we found they had been asked for preferences beforehand. We found that they almost invariably took the school that they had said they liked best. So one of the things we did is we organized the system so that they now only get one offer. They get an offer from the school that they ranked highest that's willing to accept them. And that allows a lot more students to get offers. Another thing that's going on is the market has to be safe. So in the city of Boston, they had an existing school choice system that sounded very nice. They tried to give as many people as possible their first choice. The problem with that is if you didn't get your first choice, it was very likely that your second choice was going to be full of people who had listed it as their first choice. So it became very important to think carefully what you should list as your first choice. You couldn't just list your first choice as your first choice. So we've now made it safe for them to do that. We've now made it safe in Boston so that families can list the schools in the order in which they prefer them, and if they don't get their first choice, they'll have just as much chance of getting their second choice as if they had listed it first. And that lifts a big burden of strategizing from families, and it also gives the school system good data on what schools people like. So those are the kinds of market design things that we think about, and we've been able to do them in a couple of American cities now. Yes. You have a microphone for this job? You
can go next.
Oh, sorry. Someone
Thanks.
has a microphone already.
Yes, I have a microphone.
Wave your hand. I can't see you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. I find this so fascinating. And as an economist by training, I love the sort of optimization problem in it all. But I think one thing that the next step I have a question about is the sort of understandability of the system for everyone who participates. Because I think that while ideally any optimal solution would be very elegant, I imagine sometimes they're quite complex. And in some markets that may not matter, but some things like the public school assignment, people are sort of unwilling participants. Like they don't have choose to be part of it. They have to be part of it. And if they don't understand it, there may be broken trust. There may be confusion. So how does that both go into how you design the market, and then what are the implications for when you're rolling it out and trying to make it successful?
Right. That's a giant consideration. And what we've come to understand is that communicating about how the system works is part of the design of the system. So what we've started to tell school districts is not just that we'll help you design an algorithm that has good properties, but we'll help you design an algorithm and a communication package that will help convey it, because indeed we had some startup problems of this sort. So there are a couple of ways that a school choice system can be complex. I just described to you the old system used in Boston. And it was simple. I was able to describe it to you. It was simple to describe, but it was complex to participate in, because you couldn't just put down your first choice as your first choice. You had to know all sorts of things about the schools. For instance, Boston schools would give sibling priority to children who had an older sib in the school. And so parents who had children about to enter kindergarten, if they were in prosperous, well-informed, highly educated neighborhoods, they would develop an intelligence network that knew how many SIBs there were going in, so they'd know how many places were really in each school. It was hard work. So we've got a system that's a little more complicated to describe, but it's very simple to play. You just decide which schools you like, and it's safe to tell Boston Public Schools which schools you like. So I could describe the system that we use is not that hard to describe. It's based on the deferred acceptance algorithm that Lloyd Shapley just got the Nobel Prize for. He and I shared it. It's pretty simple to describe. I won't do it right now. It's more complicated to describe than try to give everyone their first choice and then give as many people as possible their second choice, than that system. But that system is hard to play. So I think what happens is we communicate what's going on. Some people understand it. It's enough, though, if other people just get the message that it's safe to put down your true preferences.
Well, thank you, Professor. This has been fascinating. You must find it very rewarding to have created work that saved thousands of lives. Can I ask where else you'd like to see this work applied? What else you'd like to transform?
Right. Well, so we started with these sort of centralized marketplaces, not because those are the most common or whatever, but because those are the easiest to get your arms around and see where the design is, where the rules are. But most marketplaces operate on decentralized rules. And in some of the marketplaces we've worked on, markets for later career doctors in various specialties, for instance, what we've done is we've changed the rules of engagement in decentralized markets, rules about the market culture, how an offer of employment should be made, how long it should be left open, whether people can change their minds under what circumstances. So having rules like that in decentralized markets is part of their design, and it's part of their culture. It's a soft part of the rules. Often when you actually see markets operating, there are conventions about that make the market work well or badly, but there may not be trade organizations that can provide guidelines, although sometimes there are. So I think that we need to do more about thinking about decentralized markets. We also, as a profession, economists have spent a lot of time thinking about the price of transactions, but not very much time thinking about their timing. So for instance, now when we look at securities markets and high-speed trading, there are questions about whether would we really lose a lot of efficiency if instead of being able to trade at any time, you could only trade every second on the second. But if that's a tiny change, right, because there's very little real economic information that happens in a second. But of course, high-speed traders who can trade in milliseconds, they can force liquidity providers to have bigger spreads because they can get information earlier and trade against stale spreads, things like that. So I think questions like that, how should we be thinking about the microstructure of financial markets are things that we'll surely have to think about. I see market design everywhere. So if you type market design in Google, you'll find my blog by the name of Market Design. And I make a post almost every day, and some of them are not very germane. But basically, it's because I see market design everywhere. I started it for a class, and I just wanted them to know that I could stand up here and tell you things that could use market design a lot. But if you type market design into Google, you'll see the kind of things I've been concerned with.
So thank you for that insightful talk. Do you think some of the theories that
Wave your hand. I can't see you.
I'm here.
I got you. Okay.
Do you think some of the market matching theories are more applicable in emerging markets where there are institutional gaps?
Yep. So, I think for development economics, I think market design is a big thing. I talked about commodity markets at the beginning of my talk, and I said, well, commodity markets are easy. Price decides who gets what. But of course, commodity markets have to be designed. God designed wheat, but wheat isn't a commodity. Number 2 red winter wheat is a commodity. And number 2 red winter wheat, God didn't make that. The Chicago Board of Trade made that. Now, why is it good to have number 2 red winter wheat as a commodity? Well, wheat is different. Different farmers grow different stuff. And before we had a commodity market for wheat, you had to know your farmer. You had to have someone go out in the field and inspect it. How much white wheat is mixed with the red wheat? How much moisture? How many bugs? So once you have a commodity and enforceable standards, you can all of a sudden not care who the farmer is. The railroads can come by and they can take the number 2 red winter wheat and mix it together in rail cars and not care who it came from. But before that, the market for wheat was a matching market. So Ethiopia has just made a commodity market, a good one or a better one, for coffee. So it used to be that if you wanted to buy coffee, you had to send your man to Addis, and he would taste coffee. He would reach a long-handled spoon into big bags of coffee and pull out some beans and grind them and taste them and decide whether he wanted to buy coffee from this farmer. Well, now they've got a system, a market design where there's anonymous tasting. There are guys who receive bags of coffee and sample them and don't know who's the farmer, and they can make reliable judgments about quality. Turns out, what do I know about this? Because of this, I've learned about coffee. It turns out what makes high-quality coffee, among other things, is waiting until the cherry is red. So a coffee bush has a cherry on it, and the bean is inside. So by the time someone has sold you the beans, you can't see whether they waited till the cherry was ripe, whether it was red or whether it was green. So the cheap way to pick coffee is you go to some hillside that's mostly red, and you say to your pickers, go pick all the beans. We're not coming back here. Get them all. But once you have tasters who can tell that you've got unripe beans together with your ripe ones, you say to the pickers, pick only the red cherries, and we'll come back next week, and we'll pick the rest when they're red. So just having a commodity market, not only does it let places like Starbucks buy by the ton, grade A coffee, but it causes there to be more grade A coffee because you now get paid back when you take the trouble to make your coffee grade A. So I'm not quite sure that's the kind of thing you were thinking of, but when I think about emerging markets, you think about how to make the markets work so that they'll be designed properly to work well for the conditions that they have there.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm really interested in the online currency Bitcoin, and I was wondering if you'd had a look at this and whether there are any aspects of that market that you think are fundamentally unworkable, or if you do think it's sustainable.
So I don't know much about Bitcoin except what I've read in the newspaper. It's sort of a cross between paper money and gold, right? It's a little like gold because it's hard to mine, right? It's hard to increase the supply. I think its advocates think of that as a good thing, but of course that's not a good thing for an economy-wide currency, because as the economy grows you need more currency, and if it's hard to get, there can be shortages. But it's also like paper money in the sense that you can't hold it in your hand, you can't use it as a commodity later, you can't use it to fill teeth, or to make jewelry. It's a fiat money. It's only money as long as people are willing to accept it as money. So I don't see it. It's pretty interesting, the fact that you have to solve computationally hard problems in order to create a new Bitcoin, and that this is something that can be verified. It's a fascinating example of an attempt to make a currency, but I can't see it becoming a large part of the world economy. And partly it's because of the limits. Gold can't be that large a part of the world economy for the same reason, right? You don't want to, here we are talking about what central banks do and how much unemployment should go with how much inflation. Gold doesn't let you do any of those things. And, commodity money made a lot of sense when we couldn't do better than that. So Bitcoin is almost a commodity money, except it's not even a commodity. So it's fascinating stuff from what I read. I wouldn't bet the whole ranch on it.
And I think that it's all the time we have for questions.
Okay. Well, thank you.